Hello and welcome to another audio autopsy. In today's video we'll be ranking all the albums from the English rock trio Muse from weakest to strongest. So without further ado, let's dive straight on in. Kicking off today's ranking, we do have the band's most recent album in the form of Will of the People, released in 2022. The band were actually approached by Warner, who wanted them to release a best of album, as most bands tend to do when you're approaching 8-9 albums. However, Muse being Muse, they decided not to do that and decided they were going to make a best of, but compromising of new material, taking a walk down memory lane over their career and basing the sounds and styles of the album off previous works. And this album does actually manage to capture those unique sounds that the band have covered. They are a playful band, they've mixed with lots of different styles, sounds over the years, and this album certainly does show that. Unfortunately, where the album does fall down is it's already a lot of different things the band have already covered, but in greater depth across the course of an album, rather than trying to cram an entire era into one or two songs. Whether it be the blocky, chunky synths of Compliance, or the assassin-esque Kill or Be Killed, or you could even look at the apocalyptical We Are Fucking Fucked, which the band covered the end of the world on Absolution and Black Holes and Revelations. So for many fans, this was a chance to get to hear new material but adopting those old styles, but they just crammed too many eras into one album, and it felt a bit disjointed at times and didn't feel like it carried that same strength that was seen on most of their previous releases. In at number 8 we do have the band's 2018 album Simulation Theory, which really saw them dive off the deep end, go into the digital world and take a trip down retro lane. Despite incorporating many typical Muse elements with these orchestral arrangements and also the typical big guitars that we did like to see from the band, it felt like this style of music really stripped them of one of the strongest elements of this band, and it's their ability to play out to a massive stadium. Those retro sounds don't have the same pull and the same impact as much of their heavy guitar work, or even these orchestral elements that certainly are much stronger in filling these large open spaces. Despite that, I did actually have a couple of really interesting tracks, such as Pressure, Propaganda, and the very madness sounding Dig Down, which felt like a bit of a retrified carbon copy of a previous release with its wub 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 sound that was thrown into it. Overall though, it just didn't feel like it was as memorable as some of their previous releases. It didn't live up to those same high standards, those electrifying performances that we had seen from the band previously. In at number 7 we do have the band's 2012 album The Second Law, an album that continued to show just how exquisitely Muse could dance between different genres and incorporate different sounds and styles. With its range of eclectic influences and bombastic tendencies, it really showed how the band could continue to ramp up the ludicrousness on every single album. But on the other hand, it felt like the band turned up the ridiculousness just one level too many. The lead single from the album, Madness, did prove to be quite a hit, incorporating dubstep elements and lots of other really curious little quirks that they did throw into that track, really highlighting it as one of the biggest tracks and one of the strongest tracks on the album. But alongside that, you also had songs like Panic Station, which felt like an extremely weird smoothie of different sounds and styles, incorporating elements of Another One Bites the Dust, Thriller. You could also see elements of Michael Hutchence from In Excess, and also things such as Prince's Kiss and David Bowie's Fame. And ultimately the result ended up sounding like an electrified or rockified version of a Scissor Sisters track. Whilst it was really interesting to see the band try all these different styles and incorporate all these different elements, it just became a little bit too strange at times and felt like occasionally the album almost derailed itself. And the second half of the album really felt like it took a backseat and was almost the passenger on a drive. It didn't hit the same highs and it didn't have the same driving power that many of their other albums had included. This album ended up sounding like a lazy Sunday drive with a rather bizarre mixtape to go with it that didn't quite fit in with the theme. Coming in at number 6 we do have the band's debut studio album in the form of Showbiz, and whilst it has gone on to be a bit of a legacy album, it still doesn't show the main strengths that the band would develop as they did progress through their career. At the time of its release, it sounded just like many of the other bands of that time from the 1990s. However, tracks such as Sunburn and Muscle Museum would really show what the band were capable of, certainly from Mac Bellamy's falsetto sounding voice, and really show the prowess that they would go on to develop as they would progress through their career and would develop into the iconic sound that they still carry with them to this day. One thing that does show that the legacy of this album has developed over time is Muse's willingness to incorporate many of the tracks from this album into their live shows. As of 2015, they really started to pull more of them on board, really showing their emphasis on some of their earlier works, despite many of the tracks not being the most iconic and the most powerful numbers amongst Muse fans. In at number 5 we do have the band's 2015 album Drones, one of the most polarising albums in Muse's discography. Some feel it's the worst album the band have ever produced, some feel it belongs somewhere towards the top. One thing this album did very well though was explore this dystopian future or present without going too apocalyptical and talking about the end of the world. This album really saw the band delve into a slightly more aggressive form of rock, really with tracks such as Psycho and Dead Inside. We did see the more aggressive side of Matt Bellamy's voice, which can be quite difficult to do with that falsetto sound that he is so used to using. Because of this, it was really on the guitars to provide that more distorted, heavy sound, and that was shown through some of the techniques the band did use with these almost distorted vocals, almost adding this cutting edginess to this album to really give it the sharpness that it needed. And it's hard to deny that the songwriting was very strong on this album. It really managed to capture the way that many people feel they're being controlled, that we're all walking down the same path, and that was shown through many of the visuals as well as the actual lyrics that were included in many of those tracks. Whether it be through a political climate reminiscent of a George Orwell novel, or the dread that could be provided from the idea of death from above, it ultimately provided a very searing commentary on the current state of the world at the time. However, at the same time, many felt that it was a little bit too on the nose of an album. It felt like it was a subject that the band should be steering clear of, focus on the apocalypse and the end of the world and leave the politics alone. It also came at a time where the band were really unsure of where they wanted to go with their style, given the two albums either side of it were The Second Law with its very bizarre mix of sounds and the highly retro Simulation Theory on the other. In at number 4 we do have the band's second studio album in the form of Origin of Symmetry. This album really saw the band continue to build on the strong foundation they'd set themselves with Showbiz, really setting themselves apart from many of the other bands of the late 90s such as Radiohead, who they'd often be compared with. This album also introduced us to two extremely strong tracks, their very dark and grungy cover of Feeling Good, as well as the iconic distorted intro into the wavering guitar of Plug-in Baby. This album did however throw more than just those two punches. We also had tracks such as Hyper Music, Newborn, Bliss and a variety of others that really provided the strong backbone to make it an all-round strong album. The only thing that was almost lacking from this album was that it didn't really have any set structure, it didn't follow any particular themes, it felt like more of an amalgamation of different tracks and ideas that the band had put together rather than having that completeness and that story to go with it. This is something that the band would really truly start to develop over following albums. Just squeezing its way into the top 3 we do have the band's 2009 album The Resistance. Led by its romping, stomping, fight back track in the form of Uprising, the album really did prove to be quite a strong hit. The track has gone on to become probably one of the most recognisable in Muse's discography, purely because of its raw driving power, and the second track, Resistance, really acted as a strong left-hand lieutenant in providing the album with more of a backbone and stopping it from being a one-trick pony. And at the same time, you can't also forget the incredible string arrangement on Undisclosed Desires, which also featured this very fuzzy undertone and this almost subtleness to Matt Bellamy's voice that really powered through and really gave a strong emotive section to this album. Despite not holding the same raw power of some of their previous releases, the band certainly showed a much more mature and much more constructed sound with this album. It's starting to see them really delve into almost more cinematic effects with the 3-part Exogenesis trilogy that came at the end of the album. And although the band really tried to recapture the imagination they showed on this album with future releases such as The Second Law and Simulation Theory, they weren't able to really produce them up to the same level as this particular album. Coming in at the silver medal spot we do have the band's 2006 album Black Holes and Revelations. An LP that was led by a trio of Goliath tracks in the form of Starlight, Supermassive Black Hole and Knights of Sidonia. This is definitely the point in time where the band showed the most creative flair. This album really incorporates so many different sounds and styles, whether it be the piano-driven form of Starlight or even the westernized sounds that we did see on Knights of Sidonia. Alongside that, you also had the very heavy cut from Assassin and also Map of the Problematique, which felt like it would belong on the intro to the Crystal Maze. This was definitely the point in the band's career where they were riding this extremely high tidal wave of performance, power, and just versatility in the music that they were producing. The only thing that really kept this album off the top spot is that it suffered from the same thing as Will of the People. It felt like a culmination of lots of different extremely strong singles, but as a culmination as a whole album, it didn't quite have that same well-roundedness and that same backstory to it that we did see on the album that does hold the top spot. That does leave us with our winner for today, the 2004 album Absolution, which is an absolutely fantastic album and certainly one of the strongest that the band have ever produced. This album really saw the band delve into the morbidity of an apocalypse and really explore it through a continual trace of different tracks that all bled this constant idea of the world coming to its ultimate destruction. Thematically, everything blended together very well. Tracks such as Hysteria that really triggered this idea of mass pandemonium, the idea of time is running out, really ticking down the seconds that our world has left to live, and the cleverly crafted thoughts of a dying atheist, leaving a non-religious man to wonder what exactly comes next. It certainly appears on this album that nothing sparks creativity more than the end of the world. And it wasn't only the lyrics that were running on full steam, the instruments certainly were as well, whether it be the incredible intro to Hysteria, this extremely iconic bass line from Chris that still to this day is probably for most people in their top 10 bass lines of all time, all the way to the energy inducing drums that Dom would provide on tracks such as Time Is Running Out. This really did feel like the album where everything clicked, everything came together, and it certainly shows through every element that was drawn onto this album. Even some of the shorter tracks such as the 22-second intro and the 37-second interlude that are thrown in between, it had the thematics, it had the creative flair to really show some of these prominent elements that really set the album aside from all of the other releases that were around at the same time. And it also still remains one of the most memorable albums that the band have released even still to this day. So there we do have it, all of the Muse albums ranked from weakest to strongest, but I would love for you to put your list of how you rank the albums in the comments section below. Let me know if you agree with some of my thoughts and decisions. I'm sure that Drones is going to be an album many people will be placing all over the place because many just had that reaction to it upon its release, but I would love to know your thoughts and how you feel about where the albums do rank. And if you want to see more content like this, then please do feel free to subscribe, and I will see you in the next Audio Autopsy.